Stop. That's enough.
It is the hot summer of 1981 on a noisy red double-decker bus rattling through North London toward Watford. A 17-year-old kid with big glasses and curly hair is sitting near the back staring out the window. He works as a cinema usher, handing out popcorn and checking tickets for a few pounds a week. As he hands his change to the bus conductor, a melody suddenly flashes into his head out of nowhere. 4 notes. A smooth, melancholic sax line that sounds like a secret being whispered in a dark room. He does not have a tape recorder. He does not have a notebook. So for the rest of the 40-minute bus ride, he hums those 4 notes over and over under his breath, terrified that if he stops for even 10 seconds, the song will evaporate into the London traffic. His name is Georgios Kyriakos Panayotou, though the world would soon know him as George Michael. He was 17 years old. And on that ordinary bus ride, he had just invented the most famous saxophone riff in the history of recorded music. We will get to how that very sax riff almost destroyed the song before it was ever released. But not yet, because here is the strange thing about Careless Whisper. It is a song everyone thinks they know by heart. The ultimate slow dance, the late-night radio anthem, the soundtrack to a million candlelit dinners. And yet, almost everything you assume about how it was made and what it really means is completely backwards. It was not written by a seasoned crooner at a grand piano. It was not recorded in one magical take in a legendary studio. In fact, George Michael hated the first version so much he spent thousands of dollars to throw the entire master tape in the trash. This is not a story about a Hollywood romance. It is not a story about a broken heart from a long marriage. It is not even a story written by a superstar at the peak of his fame. It is the story of a teenager carrying a dirty secret, an audition that drove 11 professional musicians to tears, and a sneaky recording trick that changed pop music forever. The song is Careless Whisper. The artist is George Michael, and this is the true story of the riff he spent years trying to escape. To understand where those 4 notes came from, you have to picture George Michael before the leather jacket and the designer sunglasses. In 1981, he was just a self-conscious kid living in Bushey, a suburb north of London. He and his best friend Andrew Ridgeley were obsessed with pop music. They spent their afternoons in Andrew's bedroom with an old acoustic guitar, dreaming of escaping their quiet suburban lives. One afternoon, Andrew picked up the guitar and started strumming a simple moody sequence of 4 chords in D minor. It was simple, almost classical, but the moment George heard those chords, something clicked. The melody he had heard on the bus weeks earlier locked into place, right on top of Andrew's rhythm. In less than an hour, the basic structure of Careless Whisper was born on a cheap guitar in a teenager's bedroom. Listen to what the song was actually doing underneath that pop sheen. George Michael was not just writing a catchy tune. He was tapping into a classic music theory trick called a minor line cliché. The chord progression steps down slowly, note by note, creating a descending scale that your ear interprets as weight, sadness, and inevitability. It creates a lingering tension that never fully resolves. You feel like you are falling slowly in reverse. Now here is the detail everyone misses. At that moment, Wham did not even exist as a famous band yet. They had no record deal, no money, and no fans. When they finally signed a contract a year later, their label wanted bright, energetic, synth-heavy party tracks like Young Guns and Wham Rap. Careless Whisper was tucked away in a drawer, considered too slow and too mature for 2 teenage boys in neon shorts. So hold that thought, because by 1983, Wham had exploded into a global phenomenon. They were topping the charts in the UK, playing to screaming crowds of teenagers across Europe. But George Michael was restless. He did not want to be just a teen idol. He wanted to be taken seriously as a songwriter alongside Stevie Wonder and Elton John. And he remembered the moody ballad sitting in his drawer. That was when the label decided to make a power move. They flew 20-year-old George Michael all the way to Muscle Shoals Sound Studio in Alabama, the legendary recording sanctuary where Aretha Franklin, the Rolling Stones, and Paul Simon made their classic records. They hired Jerry Wexler, the legendary producer who had shaped the sound of American soul music for 30 years. Jerry Wexler brought in the finest session musicians in America. He booked top studio players, including legendary saxophonist Mel Collins, to record the saxophone solo. They recorded a full version of Careless Whisper. The playing was technically flawless, The production was warm, expensive, and polished. Wexler handed the tape to George, convinced they had a monster #1 record on their hands. George Michael listened to the tape in his headphones. He listened once, he listened twice, and then he said no. He hated it. To anyone else the recording sounded beautiful, but to George it sounded like a slick, comfortable American R&B track. It lacked the raw, lonely ache he had carried in his head ever since that bus ride in Watford. He felt the saxophone lines sounded polite instead of painful. So to the absolute horror of his record executives, 20-year-old George Michael walked away from Jerry Wexler's master tape. He shelved a session that cost tens of thousands of dollars and flew back to London empty-handed. Before we go further, if you love discovering how iconic songs were almost buried by the very people who made them, hit the subscribe button and stay with me. Because what George Michael did next in a cold London studio is one of the most stubborn acts of artistic perfectionism in pop history. Back in London, George booked time at Vision Studios with engineer Chris Porter. He was determined to re-record Careless Whisper from scratch, exactly as he heard it in his head. And the hardest part by far was finding someone who could play those 4 iconic saxophone notes. And this is where it gets strange. Chris Porter and George Michael called in the top studio saxophonists in London. One by one, the musicians walked into the booth, put their instruments to their lips, and played the line. One player sounded too jazzy, another sounded too aggressive, another sounded too mechanical. George sat behind the glass shaking his head. 11 different professional saxophonists played that line, and George rejected every single one of them. The engineers thought George was losing his mind. The line was only 9 bars long. How hard could it be for a world-class musician to play 9 bars of music? Here was the secret problem nobody realized at the time. The melody George Michael had written in his head stepped across a key transition that was physically awkward on an alto or tenor saxophone. To get that specific sound, the sax player had to hit a high note and bend the pitch slightly downward, a microtonal scoop that required precise lip pressure. Most players hit the note clean and straight, which destroyed the sorrowful, pleading character George was desperate to capture. Finally, on a wet Tuesday afternoon, the 12th saxophonist walked into Vision Studios. His name was Steve Gregory. He was a veteran session player who was tired, having just rushed across town from another recording session, carrying his Selmer Mark VI saxophone. Steve Gregory listened to the tape demo, put the sax to his lips, and tried to play the passage. But there was an immediate technical obstacle. The song was in the key of D minor, and the top note of George's riff sat right at the very upper limit of the sax's natural range. When Gregory tried to play it at normal speed, the note sounded pinched and strained. That was when engineer Chris Porter had a brilliant, sneaky idea. He walked over to the tape machine and adjusted the pitch controls, slowing the master recording tape down by half a semitone. Steve Gregory played the saxophone solo, while the tape was running slow, allowing him to reach the high notes effortlessly, without straining the horn. When he finished the take, Chris Porter engaged the tape motor, speeding the recording back up to its original tempo. When they played the monitor speakers back in the control room, everyone froze. The slight speed increase gave the saxophone an extraordinary, silky, almost haunting timbre. The pitch bend on the opening note had a liquid, sorrowful glide that no human breath could produce naturally on a standard horn. It sounded vulnerable, it sounded romantic, it sounded unforgettable. George Michael looked up from the mixing desk and smiled. That was the take. Now, while the saxophone riff became the crown jewel of the track, stay with me, because the lyric hiding underneath it carries an even stranger secret. For 40 years, fans have listened to Careless Whisper as the ultimate breakup tragedy, a story of a man whose heart was shattered by a devastating betrayal. But years later, George Michael confessed the truth in an interview with Q magazine, and the real inspiration was far less romantic. When George was 16, long before he was famous, he was simultaneously dating 2 different girls, named Jane and Helen. He was not a suave Lothario. He was an insecure suburban teenager who suddenly found himself caught in a web of clumsy teenage deception. He spent months terrified that one girl would find out about the other, living in a constant state of panic and self-loathing whenever he was out on the dance floor. Listen to the most famous line in the song, "Guilty feet have got no rhythm." People always assume that line is a poetic metaphor about emotional distance, but George admitted it was almost literal. When you are carrying a guilty conscience while standing next to someone who trusts you, your body freezes up. You cannot relax. You cannot move naturally. Your feet literally lose their rhythm because your mind is consumed by the fear of being exposed. George Michael later admitted something that shocked music critics. He was actually frustrated by how massive Careless Whisper became. He wrote those lyrics when he was 17 years old, on a bus ride feeling guilty about two high school girlfriends. And yet that simple teenage confession resonated more deeply with the global public than songs he spent months carefully crafting as an adult. It taught him a profound lesson about art. Listeners do not care about how complex your ideas are. They care about how honest your feelings sound. When Careless Whisper was released in August 1984, it did not just become a hit. It became a cultural earthquake. It reached #1 in 25 countries, selling over 6 million copies worldwide. It transformed George Michael overnight from a pop heartthrob into one of the respected vocalists of his generation. Go back and listen to Steve Gregory's opening saxophone line today. That 9-bar solo, recorded on a slowed-down tape machine after 11 musicians were sent home, became the defining sound of 80s pop culture. It has been sampled in hip-hop, featured in blockbuster films, and played on radio stations every single day for over 40 years. Where were you the first time that iconic saxophone riff caught your ear? Tell me in the comments below. When you listen to Careless Whisper, now remember 3 things. First, the iconic saxophone line was not born in a multi-million-dollar studio. It was imagined by a 17-year-old kid riding a bus with change in his pocket. Second, greatness often requires stubborn perfectionism. George Michael was willing to throw away a fortune and fire 11 legendary musicians just to protect 9 bars of music. And finally, the songs that stay with us forever are rarely the ones that try to sound clever. They are the ones that capture a moment of pure, uncomfortable human truth and refuse to let it go. The riff was born on a bus. The recording was saved by a tape trick, and the song will never leave us.
When Careless Whisper was released in August 1984, it did not just become a hit. It became a cultural earthquake. It reached #1 in 25 countries, selling over 6 million copies worldwide. It transformed George Michael overnight from a pop heartthrob into one of the respected vocalists of his generation. Go back and listen to Steve Gregory's opening saxophone line today. That 9-bar solo, recorded on a slowed-down tape machine after 11 musicians were sent home, became the defining sound of 80s pop culture. It has been sampled in hip-hop, featured in blockbuster films, and played on radio stations every single day for over 40 years. Where were you the first time that iconic saxophone riff caught your ear? Tell me in the comments below. When you listen to Careless Whisper now, remember 3 things. First, the iconic saxophone line was not born in a multi-million-dollar studio. It was imagined by a 17-year-old kid riding a bus with change in his pocket. Second, greatness often requires stubborn perfectionism. George Michael was willing to throw away a fortune and fire 11 legendary musicians just to protect 9 bars of music. And finally, the songs that stay with us forever are rarely the ones that try to sound clever. They are the ones that capture a moment of pure, uncomfortable human truth and refuse to let it go. The riff was born on a bus. The recording was saved by a tape trick, and the song will never leave us.